Welcome to the quiet edge of the night. If you are listening to this, the day has finally folded its heavy wings. It is time to let go of the noise, the rushing, the endless demands of the waking hours. I invite you to pull the blanket a little higher, let your shoulders sink into the mattress, and allow your breathing to slow down. Listen to the silence of your room. Perhaps you can hear the faint, rhythmic ticking of a clock somewhere nearby. Tick, tock. It is a peaceful sound now, a gentle metronome guiding you towards sleep. But tonight, as we drift backward through the corridors of time, we will listen to another clock. A grand, invisible mechanism of brass and iron, winding tighter and tighter in the shadows of a sunlit world. History often tells us that empires fall because of thunderous battles, but tonight we will see how the greatest destruction in human history began not with a roar, but with a whisper, a misread map, and a single, fatal, wrong turn. Close your eyes and let us travel to the summer of 1914. Imagine the European continent basking in the golden, honeyed light of an endless summer. This was an era they called La Belle Époque, the beautiful age. Breathe in the imagined scent of roasted coffee beans and sweet pastries drifting from the elegant, marble-floored cafes of Vienna. Listen to the faint, sweeping melodies of a Strauss waltz floating through the open windows of grand ballrooms where silk dresses rustled against polished wooden floors. In Paris, the newly illuminated street lamps cast a warm, electric glow over the cobblestones, reflecting a society obsessed with art, poetry, and the boundless promises of modern science. In London, the heart of an empire where the sun never set, horse-drawn carriages clattered rhythmically alongside the first sputtering motorcars, carrying aristocrats to garden parties scented with blooming roses and freshly cut grass. It was a world that believed it had conquered the Dark Ages. The monarchs of Europe, many of them cousins who spent their summers together sailing on the calm, sparkling waters of the Baltic Sea, sat atop thrones that seemed carved from eternal stone. They looked out over their vast, wealthy domains and believed that humanity had simply become too civilized, too interconnected, and too prosperous for a massive, continent-shattering war. They thought the foundation of their world was solid bedrock, but under the heavy velvet curtains and the crystal chandeliers, the floorboards were already rotting. The peace of 1914 was a fragile illusion. It was not a genuine harmony, but rather a terrifyingly complex clockwork of paranoia. For decades, the great powers had been quietly forging secret treaties in dimly lit rooms, signing papers with scratching steel pens that bound their fates together. If one nation moved, the gears would turn, pulling another into the machinery, and then another. They had built a mountain of dry kindling, convinced that their immense armies and towering steel battleships would act as a deterrent, a guarantee of peace. They were so blinded by the blinding reflection of their own polished armor that they forgot a simple, timeless truth of the universe. When you build a machine designed for pure destruction, eventually the machine will demand to be turned on. If you are lying in the dark right now, completely still, try to imagine the sheer weight of millions of lives hanging by a single invisible thread. The emperors and politicians believed they were the ones holding the thread. They did not realize the thread was already fraying. The spark did not come from a grand declaration in a gilded palace. It came from a dusty, sun-baked street in a provincial city on the edges of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the city of Sarajevo. It was the 28th of June, a Sunday morning. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. The air was thick with the heat of early summer, smelling of river water, dust, and the faint, acrid exhaust of early automobiles. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the most ancient throne in Europe, was riding in an open-topped luxury car. He wore a brilliantly tailored blue tunic, his chest heavy with gleaming medals, his magnificent plumed hat catching the sunlight. Beside him sat his beloved wife, Sophie, holding a silk parasol to shield her eyes from the glare. They were there on a mission of peace, a royal inspection to soothe the restless territories. But in the shadows of the cheering crowds, a different force was waiting. A group of young, desperate nationalists had positioned themselves along the motorcade's route. They were not masterminds or seasoned soldiers. They were just boys, sweating in the summer heat, their hands trembling as they clutched small, heavy revolvers and crude bombs hidden in their coat pockets. The morning had already seen one failed assassination attempt. A bomb had bounced off the back of the Archduke's car, injuring bystanders. The Archduke, furious but stubbornly proud, insisted on continuing the day's schedule. He wanted to visit the wounded in the hospital. But in the chaos and confusion of the altered plans, a message was lost. And here is where the clockwork of doom clicks into its final, irreversible position. The motorcade, driving slowly through the dense, sweltering streets, made a mistake. The driver, unfamiliar with the new route, turned the heavy steering wheel to the right, steering the grand automobile into a narrow side street called Franz Josef Street. Realizing the error, the commander of the convoy shouted for the driver to stop and reverse. Imagine that exact second. The heavy, mechanical grinding of the car's gears shifting, the vehicle coming to a complete, agonizingly slow halt directly in front of a small delicatessen, the smell of fresh bread and cured meats hanging in the warm air. Standing right there, by sheer, unimaginable coincidence, having given up on the assassination plot and merely stopping to buy a sandwich, was a 19-year-old student named Gavrilo Princip. He looked up, and there, less than 5 feet away, completely stationary, was the heir to the empire. Time seemed to freeze. The waltzes in Vienna continued to play. The kings in their palaces continued to sip their morning tea. But in that narrow, dusty street, the universe held its breath. Princip stepped forward. He raised his heavy pistol. The metal hammer clicked back with a sharp, precise sound. 2 sharp, deafening cracks shattered the summer morning. The Archduke slumped forward. His wife collapsed beside him. The blue tunic slowly turned a dark, heavy crimson. Those 2 small bullets did not just end 2 lives. They severed the invisible ropes holding the world together. The echo of those shots would roll across the mountains, across the oceans, and echo through the entire 20th century. The golden age was over. The great machine had been switched on, and there was no one left on Earth who knew how to turn it off. When the echoes of those 2 gunshots finally faded in the dusty streets of Sarajevo, the world did not instantly catch fire. That is the strangest, most haunting truth of the summer of 1914. There was no immediate panic. There were no sirens wailing across the capitals of Europe. Instead, there was a profound, eerie silence, a delay, a hesitation. In the grand cafes of Vienna, gentlemen in tailored suits unfolded their morning newspapers, read the black ink detailing the Archduke's assassination, shook their heads in mild dismay, and then calmly ordered another cup of rich, dark coffee. In Paris, the theatres remained completely full. In London, the politicians were far more concerned with local disputes in Ireland than with a murder in the distant Balkans. The sun continued to shine brilliantly. The wheat fields ripened in the gentle breeze. The emperors and their ministers even went on their scheduled summer holidays, retreating to their hunting lodges and coastal villas. It felt like a localized tragedy, a stone dropped into a pond, creating ripples that would surely fade away before reaching the shore. But beneath that tranquil surface, deep within the cold, shadowed halls of the European foreign ministries, a different reality was taking shape. The mechanism had been triggered. Listen closely. In the quiet, stuffy rooms of Berlin, St. Petersburg, Vienna, and Paris, you could hear the true sound of the world ending. It was not the sound of cannons. It was the dry, crisp sound of old paper turning. It was the heavy thud of leather-bound dossiers being dropped onto polished mahogany desks. It was the sharp, rhythmic scratching of steel fountain pens, dipping into pots of dark black ink, writing out demands, ultimatums, and mobilization orders. Decades earlier, these nations had woven a massive, invisible spiderweb of alliances. They had signed treaties hidden deep in fortified vaults, stamped with thick, red wax seals. These pieces of dry, brittle parchment contained a deadly mathematical logic. If Austria-Hungary decided to punish Serbia for the assassination, then Russia, bound by a promise of protection, would have to draw its sword. But if the massive Russian army began to move, then Germany, terrified of being surrounded, would have no choice but to activate its own forces. And if Germany marched, France, bound to Russia, would immediately do the same. And then, inevitably, the British Empire would be dragged into the abyss. It was a row of heavy, iron dominoes. They had been carefully arranged over 30 years, spaced perfectly apart. And now, the first domino was tipping over, slowly, inexorably. As the days of July bled away, the realization of what was happening began to dawn on the men holding power. Panic finally set in, not in the streets, but in the palaces. Nowhere is this tragedy more heartbreaking, more profoundly absurd, than in the frantic late-night messages exchanged between two of the most powerful men on earth, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany and Tsar Nicholas II of Russia. They were not just monarchs, they were cousins. They had played together as children. They affectionately called each other Willie and Nicky. In the dead of night, as the clock ticked closer to midnight, the telegraph machines in their respective palaces began to clatter. Imagine the rhythmic metallic clicking of the telegraph ticker in a dimly lit room, the thin strip of paper spooling out, carrying desperate pleas across the dark, sleeping continent. Nicky, the Kaiser wrote in English, begging his cousin not to mobilize the vast Russian army. The whole weight of the decision lies solely on your shoulders now. And from the cold, opulent halls of the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, Tsar Nicholas replied, his heart heavy with dread. Willie, I foresee that very soon I shall be overwhelmed by the pressure brought upon me and be forced to take extreme measures which will lead to war. They sent telegram after telegram, their words laced with affection, desperation, and a creeping, icy terror. They were the absolute rulers of millions. Their chests were covered in military medals, their crowns studded with priceless diamonds. They had the theoretical power to stop the madness with a single command. But they could not. The military generals, the men in the grey and olive uniforms, stepped out of the shadows and quietly explained the brutal reality. The plans were already set. The train schedules were already printed. To stop the mobilization now, they argued, would leave the country defenseless. The machine was too big, too complex, too rigid to be halted once the first gear had turned. If you are lying in the warm blankets right now, resting your head on the soft pillow, try to imagine that sensation. The absolute, suffocating helplessness. Imagine being the absolute ruler of a vast empire, able to command millions with a single word, only to discover that your words no longer mean anything. The machine you built to protect yourself has grown larger than you. It has a mind of its own, a cold, mechanical hunger, and it is pulling you, your family, and your entire nation toward the edge of a bottomless cliff. Willie and Nicky wept in their palaces. The telegraph machines finally fell silent. The time for words had passed. The invisible threads had pulled tight, choking the life out of the fragile peace. Outside the palace windows, the sun was beginning to set on the last day of July. The gas lamps flickered to life across the continent, casting long, wavering shadows. Ah, the beautiful age was breathing its last, shallow breaths. And in the distance, the low, deep rumbling of train engines began to echo through the night. The wheels of the great machine finally began to turn. The orders for general mobilization were signed, their dark ink drying quickly in the warm, stagnant air of late summer. Across the vast, sweeping landscapes of Russia, the dense forests of Germany, the sprawling plains of Austria-Hungary, and the sun-drenched valleys of France, the lives of millions of ordinary men were suddenly interrupted. The church bells that normally rang for Sunday Mass or evening Vespers now tolled with a different, urgent rhythm. This was no longer a matter of emperors arguing over distant borders. The men in tailored suits had failed. The diplomats had fallen silent. And now, the generals and their meticulous, rigid timetables stepped forward to take absolute control of the world. The most terrifying of these mechanical blueprints was the German Schlieffen Plan. It was not a strategy of human intuition. It was a masterpiece of cold, mathematical precision. It was designed to sweep through neutral Belgium and conquer France in exactly 42 days before the massive, slow-moving Russian army could arrive on the Eastern Front. But this plan relied entirely, desperately, on the exact, unbroken speed of railway timetables. Once the first troop train departed its station, there could be no stopping, no delaying, no negotiating. If a king suddenly wanted to send a telegram of peace, he would be told it was impossible, because halting the trains would cause a catastrophic logistical failure across the entire railway network. Diplomacy was officially dead. The train schedule had become the undisputed, mechanical ruler of Europe. Picture a misty, damp morning at a grand, cavernous railway station in Berlin, or perhaps Paris or London. The air under the vast iron and glass roofs is thick with the loud, rhythmic hissing of giant steam engines. Breathe in the sharp, metallic smell of burning coal, mixing with the damp scent of heavy wool uniforms. Listen to the long, mournful wail of the train whistles, a sound that seemed to tear the very fabric of the morning fog. If you could somehow stand on those crowded platforms in the hazy days of August 1914, you would not see the terror of war. You would see a heartbreaking, terrifying innocence. Millions of young men, many who had never left their hometowns, were leaning out of the wooden windows of the passenger cars. They were smiling brightly, waving their caps to the massive, cheering crowds below. Beautiful young women in summer dresses ran alongside the slowly moving trains, tossing fresh flowers which the soldiers playfully tucked into the leather straps of their rifles and the buttonholes of their tunics. They sang loud, patriotic songs, their voices echoing off the station walls, carrying the absolute, unbroken certainty of youth. They had been told by their teachers, their priests, and their politicians that this war would be a grand, glorious adventure, a brief, heroic crusade to defend their homeland. They shouted to their weeping mothers and proud fathers, their eyes shining with excitement, promising that the fighting would be over quickly. "We will be home before the leaves fall," they yelled. "We will be home before Christmas." They truly believed they were riding off to win honor in a world that still operated on the ancient rules of cavalry charges, bright banners, and noble duels. They did not know that they were not soldiers embarking on a grand epic. They were merely the raw fuel required to keep the furnace burning. The great machine did not care about their individual courage, their childhood dreams, or the letters they promised to write to the girls waiting for them at home. The machine only knew how to consume, and its appetite was infinite. As the heavy steel wheels began to grind against the iron tracks, pulling out of the stations, the rhythmic clacking sounded like a massive, unstoppable heartbeat, pumping the lifeblood of a generation toward the dark, waiting frontiers. The absolute tragedy of this moment in history lies in its mechanical inevitability. The leaders of Europe had willingly surrendered their free will to the logistics of industrial warfare. The human beings who had built the system, who had forged the steel and laid the tracks, had become entirely enslaved by their own creation. They were trapped on a train that was hurtling toward a broken bridge in the dark, and the men in the engine room had long ago thrown the brakes into the fire. Now, as you lie there, feeling the quiet safety of your room, safe from the cold winds of the past, consider this paradox. The clock in the high tower struck midnight on the very last day of peace. The era of gentlemen, of romantic empires and quiet summers, quietly closed its eyes forever. And on the very next dawn, without anyone truly understanding how it happened, humanity woke up trapped in an age of cold steel, barbed wire, and invisible, choking gas. The beautiful world they knew was already gone, left behind like a forgotten, faded photograph on a misty train platform. The grand illusions of the summer shattered against the cold, unyielding earth of autumn. The war of movement, of sweeping cavalry charges and bright, untarnished uniforms ground to a brutal, agonizing halt. The great armies clashed, exhausted themselves, and slowly sank into the ground. And it is here, in the cold, wet clay of Flanders and the chalky soil of northern France, that we must lower our gaze. We leave behind the marble palaces, the velvet curtains, and the polished telegraph rooms. We descend into the trenches. Imagine, if you will, a landscape completely stripped of its natural beauty, a world where the ancient, sprawling forests have been reduced to splintered, blackened matchsticks pointing accusingly toward an eternally grey sky. The earth itself has been turned inside out, pulverized by millions of artillery shells, churned into a thick, suffocating paste. This was not merely dirt. It was an ocean of brown, freezing mud that clung to leather boots, swallowed supply wagons whole, and became the permanent, terrifying home for a generation of young men. They had dug deep into the earth to escape the storm of flying steel, creating a vast, subterranean maze that stretched for hundreds of miles, from the edge of the Swiss Alps all the way to the cold, crashing waves of the North Sea. If you are lying in the quiet safety of your room, let your breathing slow down. Listen closely to the imagined sound of the rain, the slow, relentless, freezing drizzle of a European November. Listen to the rhythmic dripping as the cold water falls from the frayed edges of a canvas sandbag, striking the smooth, cold steel of a soldier's helmet. Drip, 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 drip. Hear the heavy, wet squelch of boots sinking into the waterlogged floorboards of the trench. Listen to the subtle, terrifying scratching sounds echoing in the dark, the endless scurrying of trench rats growing fat on the ruins of humanity. The true psychological weight of this underground world was not just the deafening roar of the massive artillery guns, it was the silence, the agonizing, drawn-out silence of the night watch, the space between the heartbeats. Imagine standing on a wooden fire step, peering over the edge of the parapet into the area they called no man's land. The moon casts a pale, ghostly light over a lunar landscape of flooded craters and tangled, rusted coils of barbed wire. The wind whistles softly through the steel thorns. The silence here is not peaceful. It is heavily pregnant with anticipation. It is the silence of thousands of men buried in the earth on both sides, breathing softly, holding their rifles, waiting for the piercing, unnatural shriek of a brass whistle. When that whistle blew, they would have to climb up the wooden ladders and walk slowly, heavily, into a wall of machine gun fire. For what? For a few yards of ruined, poisoned earth. The great machine that the emperors had started was no longer a mechanism of precise railway schedules. It had transformed into a blind, insatiable meat grinder. It stripped away all the romance of individual heroism. A soldier's bravery no longer mattered when death fell randomly from the sky in the form of heavy, screaming artillery shells. The clockwork of doom was churning, grinding bone and steel together, rendering human life as cheap as the mud they slept in. Yet, why did they continue to climb out of those trenches? Why did they step into the void? Perhaps it was duty. Perhaps it was the fear of being branded a coward. Or perhaps they were simply trapped. They were tiny, helpless cogs caught deep within the teeth of a machine that had grown far too large for any single human being to stop. But history is a tapestry woven with profound contradictions. Even in the deepest, darkest abyss of this man-made hell, the human spirit occasionally flickered. A tiny, defiant candle refusing to be blown out by the hurricane. It was late December 1914, the first winter of the war. The rain had stopped, and a bitter, freezing frost had hardened the mud. A light, pure snow began to fall, softly covering the scarred earth, hiding the wire and the craters beneath a blanket of pristine white. And then a sound drifted across the frozen expanse of no man's land. It was not the crack of a rifle. It was a voice, a single young German voice, singing softly into the frigid night air. Stille Nacht, heilige Nacht, silent night, holy night. In the British trenches, the sentries lowered their rifles. They listened, their breath pluming in the cold air. Slowly, cautiously, the British soldiers began to sing back. A, 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 A. The carols echoed back and forth across the valley of death. Then, faint yellow lights appeared on the German parapets. Small candles perched on the edges of the mud. Slowly, men began to stand up. They climbed out of the trenches without their weapons. they walked out into the frozen, moonlit wasteland. Men who had been trying to kill each other only hours before now met in the middle. They shook hands. They shared cigarettes, exchanged small gifts of chocolate and brass buttons, and showed each other faded photographs of their wives and children. For one brief, miraculous night, the soldiers themselves reached out and stopped the gears of the great machine. They reclaimed their humanity. It is a moment so beautiful, it breaks the heart. Because we, looking back from the future, know the tragic truth. The generals and the politicians miles behind the lines were furious. Orders were quickly issued. The officers drew their pistols, forcing the men back into the mud. The truce ended. The candle was blown out. The snow would melt, the mud would return, and the terrible machine would grind on, mindlessly, mercilessly, for 4 more agonizing years. The hands of the great clock finally ground to a halt. It was the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month in the year 1918. Across the ruined, scarred landscape of Europe, a sound far more shocking than the heaviest artillery barrage suddenly fell from the grey autumn sky. It was the sound of absolute, overwhelming silence. Imagine standing in a muddy trench on that morning. The air is still thick with the acrid, stinging smell of cordite and pulverized earth. For 4 long years, your ears have known nothing but the deafening, mechanical roar of the slaughter. And then, as the minute hand clicks to the top of the hour, the guns simply stop. A lone bird, perhaps a skylark, flies over the devastated wasteland of no man's land and begins to sing. The soldiers do not cheer. They do not celebrate. They slowly climb out of the earth, covered in clay and exhaustion, and stand in the misty morning air like ghosts. They simply stare at each other across the craters, their minds unable to comprehend that the machine has finally run out of fuel. The clockwork of doom had stopped, but the world it left behind was unrecognizable. When the heavy smoke finally cleared, 4 of the most powerful empires in human history had completely vanished into dust. Think of the majestic palaces we visited at the beginning of our journey, the sparkling ballrooms of Vienna, the grand halls of St. Petersburg, the military parades of Berlin. Now, picture them cold, empty, and silent. The ancient crowns of the Romanovs, the Habsburgs, the Hohenzollerns, and the Ottomans, crowns forged from solid gold and studded with diamonds, which had ruled for centuries, were now just heavy, useless pieces of metal tumbling into the cold winter snow. Kaiser Wilhelm, the proud Willie who had loved his gleaming uniforms, was forced to abdicate, fleeing in a train in the dead of night to live out his days in quiet, bitter exile. Tsar Nicholas, his beloved cousin Nicky, had already met a far darker fate in a cold cellar in Siberia, his entire dynasty erased in a single night of gunfire. The men who believed they held the reins of destiny were swept away like dry leaves in a storm. They had built a system so complex, so rigid, that it ended up crushing its own creators. This is the ultimate, humbling lesson of history. The grandest illusions of human control, the most terrifying displays of worldly power, are all entirely impermanent. Time is the only true conqueror. The millions of men who fought, the generals who drew lines on maps, the kings who signed treaties, they have all returned to the quiet earth. The deafening roar of their great war is now nothing more than a faint, fading echo in the pages of old, dusty books. The trenches of Flanders are now green, peaceful fields where red poppies gently sway in the spring breeze. Nature has quietly reclaimed the scars. And so, as you lie here tonight, safe within the quiet walls of your room, let this realization wash over you like a warm, soothing wave. If the greatest empires of the world, with all their vast wealth and invincible armies, eventually crumble into silent dust, then the worries that weigh heavy on your mind today are also passing shadows. The deadlines, the arguments, the anxieties of the waking world, they are just small ripples on the vast ocean of time. You do not need to control everything. You do not need to carry the weight of tomorrow. Just like the snow that falls softly over a ruined battlefield, hiding the sharp edges of the past, sleep is here to cover your exhausted mind. Let your breathing become slow, deep, and rhythmic. Feel the tension melting away from your jaw, your neck, and your shoulders. The gears of the day have stopped turning. The machine is quiet. Ah, you are safe. You are warm. If this journey through the shadows of history has brought you a moment of peace, leave a gentle subscription before you drift away. Let your eyes close heavily now. Let the darkness embrace you. Sleep well, and we will meet again in the past. Tomorrow night,